Literally right on time. So good evening. My name is Amy Ring, and I'd like to welcome you tonight to what is the OSTROM Memorial Lecture, but also the launch of our Smart Cities Conference here at IU. So for those of you who aren't aware of that, tomorrow in the OSTROM workshop, we will be gathering to talk about smart cities. What does that mean? Yeah, good question. That's the first question. Then we'll begin to talk about. We're going to take on a whole bunch of issues during the course of the day, and you are more than welcome to come over whatever time you have available if you're interested in it. The agenda is actually on the OSTROM workshop website. We start around 9-ish. We should be done around 5-ish because we're academics and they told us 10 minutes, and it will undoubtedly not only be 10 minutes. That's what we do well. So I'd like to welcome you, and now I'm going to introduce Scott Shackelford, who's in charge of the cybersecurity program at the OSTROM workshop. Thank you. Hope to see you all tomorrow.
Good evening, everyone. Yes, and welcome. As was mentioned, I'm Scott Shackelford, so I'm chair of our cybersecurity risk management program at IU. For the students in the room, applications are now open for the masters in cybersecurity risk management. I'm happy to answer any questions you guys have. But much more important for our purposes this evening is I'm director of the OSTROM workshop program on cybersecurity and internet governance, which is a relatively new program. It itself just launched last year. So I'll say a few words about that, about the memorial lecture, and then introduce our distinguished speaker for the evening. Okay. So how many of you, just out of curiosity, are familiar with the OSTROMs, with Lynn Ostrom and Vincent Ostrom? Okay, at least half. This is positive. This is good. It's a captive audience. So this is kind of self-selection, but still. So as you know, many of you then, the OSTROMs were very keen on thinking through the various ways in which governance happens at multiple scales, right? So we're using some of the work that they have built up over decades in the fields of institutional analysis, political economy, policy-centered governance, and applying it to new areas like cybersecurity and internet governance, right? So as you can tell with our banner, we're pushing the frontiers as much as possible of governance research. And frankly, this evening is a great example of how we were doing that. We're lucky to be joined by Georgia Tech Professor Milton Mueller for our OSTROM Memorial Lecture this evening. If you're not familiar, this is a relatively new lecture series as well. It was launched in 2015 to honor the memory of Lynn Ostrom and Vincent Ostrom. This evening we're going to be focusing on one of these new domains, cyberspace. As you can tell, all the ways in which sovereignty is being tried, tested, not always successfully applied to this new domain. Professor Mueller, as a wonderful example to help us do just that, he's an internationally prominent scholar specializing in political economy of information and communication. He's the author of 7 books, which I'm sure you read all those in preparation for the evening. There'll be a quick at the end. Lots of good examples. If you haven't read it, do check them out, especially the most recent ones. Will the Internet Fragment? So that'll come up a bit this evening. Networks and States, the global politics of internet governance, and ruling the roots. Internet governance and the taming of cyberspace. Dr. Mueller's prominence and scholarship is matched by his prominence in policy practice, which is one reason we invited him for the evening, because as you know, those familiar with the OSTROMs, they did groundbreaking research, but they also really wanted to have the research be policy relevant. And that's one thing we're trying to further with this series as well. He is co-founder and director of the Internet Governance Project, for example, which is a policy analysis center for global internet governance. Since 2004, when it was founded, it's played a prominent role in shaping global internet governance policies, including at really important forums like ICANN, which is the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. If you haven't heard of it so far, you'll know plenty about it by the end of the evening. Dr. Mueller has also been a practical institution builder in the scholarly world. He's created, for example, the Global Internet Governance Academic Network, or GigaNet, which is a fantastic network of internet governance scholars around the world. And this evening, Professor Mueller will be discussing his project, Sovereignty in Cyberspace, Institutions and Internet Governance. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Mueller.
Yes, after an introduction like that, I feel like it can only be downhill.
Appreciate that.
We're done. No. So it really was a unique treat for me to be invited to give the Ostrom Memorial Lecture because I have been a fan of the, particularly ELINOR's Ostrom work. I wasn't that familiar with Vince's, but I understand that they were very co-evolutionary in their thinking. And for me, Ostrom served a very practical purpose that was helping me solve the problems that I was confronting, somebody with no appropriate theoretical background, just kind of finding my way through some unique and interesting problems. And then one day in a used bookstore, I think I told my colleagues about this, I have this theory that a certain time I go into a used bookstore, there's a book that's calling me, and I come out with some kind of a life-changing book. So in this case, it was Governing the Commons. I think I picked it up in 1992 or something like that, and it was really an eye-opener. So let's get right into the subject of sovereignty and the internet. In fact, we've been debating this relationship from the beginning. We went from the internet is sovereign, John Perry Barlow, Johnson and Post, and the internet is exceptional, to what we're at now, which is, oh, it's not exceptional, it's got the same old problems, and we have to figure out how to renationalize it and subordinate it to state power. In fact, the battle over multi-stakeholder internet governance, how many of you have heard that term, multi-stakeholder, right? Versus multilateral or intergovernmental, that is really about sovereignty, as I hope to explain in more detail later. And unrecognized in this battle is the tremendous relevance of Ostrom's work about institutions and institutionalization, because internet governance is now and always has been about institutional innovation in the face of new technology. So several people have asked me how I got to being interested in internet governance. And I'll explain. I got involved in the 1980s as computers were just popularizing and computer technology was in the process of transforming the telecommunications structure. It was also transforming the industry and law and regulation. Though I didn't have the vocabulary or the theory yet, what really interested me was the relationship between information communication technology, institutions, and institutional change. I was fascinated in particular by some of the new resource domains that were created in telecommunications. In particular, I got my start looking at radio frequency spectrum, whether you could define ownership rights in it and what consisted of property rights, and could you trade them, or how could you have a market, or did you need central planning? These are the kinds of issues that was fascinating to me. And it was also this global process by which competitive markets were replacing national monopolies, and these national monopolies were very old and venerable institutions. The post-telephone and telegraph monopoly was something that went back centuries. So clearly something very significant was going on. However, and I hope my colleagues from the telecom department don't feel offended by this, by about 1995, I had become kind of bored with telecom policy. And the reason was that the main institutional changes had taken place. It was like the interesting stuff was kind of over. Right? We broke up the phone company. That was fun. Loved that. We introduced competition in many places. Most of the world's developed economies were following suit. They were also introducing competition, privatizing, liberalizing. Spectrum markets went from being an idea that was literally dismissed as crazy in the 80s to an idea that was routinely generating billions of dollars a year in formally sanctioned governmental auctions. We had an entirely new telecom law in the United States, the first one since 1934. And we had new free trade agreements in information technology and in basic telecommunications services that had spread this whole institutional process worldwide. Little did we know that telecom liberalization was just the first step, and it was paving the way for another, even more transformative change. That change, of course, was the internet, or to be more accurate, internetworking. Now, the techno-economic characteristics of the internet were radically different from telecommunications. Entirely new common pool resources, resource spaces, such as domain names and internet protocol addresses, were developing. New cooperative and market relationships were forming around things like routing of packets, and ISP peering and interconnection. Now, what was most interesting to me, at least, was instead of reforming and going through national regulatory processes in which we were reforming old laws to adapt incrementally to new technologies, we were generating new institutions. New bottom-up governance mechanisms were forming around this new transnational community. Mainstream telecom economists actually weren't much help in this process. They didn't understand the economics underlying internet resources and connectivity very well. Mainstream political scientists and international relations scholars had their eyes glued on traditional state actors and multilateral regimes, and were basically completely ignorant of these organically evolved internet institutions. So you can imagine what a revelation the discovery of OSTROM's work was in this context. So around 1994 to 1998, as the internet transitioned from a closed and small academic network into a major economically significant global medium, we were confronted with the need for institutional development on a global scale. Now, what was it about internet governance was so problematic, and in some ways still is? The ramifications of the question are very complicated, but in some ways the answer is quite simple, and that is what I call the problem of misalignment. The mismatch between the transnational space for societal interaction created by the internet and the territorial boundaries of the world's main governance institution, which is the nation state. The internet joins the world of governance into a single space, or at least it has the potential to do so and was doing so in the 90s. Sovereignty fragments it into 200 pieces. So as the internet developed and became used by billions of people and deeply embedded in our society, all kinds of novel conflicts and disputes arose that required rules, order, governance. Some of these problems could be addressed by existing national institutions, and were. All kinds of interesting legal precedents were being set, but many of these problems just didn't fit into that framework. And so we did get new institutions, and let's take a quick tour of some of the institutional innovations the internet has led to. I don't know how well you can read this timeline, but you can see the very first institution there, which really started out as kind of an informal committee of computer scientists in a room, is the Internet Engineering Task Force. And they gradually, literally, created their own rules from the bottom up. They just defined themselves as a new kind of an organization, which was open source. They were developing open source standards. They were based on individual participation, not on some kind of category. Are you a corporation? Are you a corporate representative? Are you a government? No, you were an individual, and it was supposed to be about the ideas you had and what those ideas could contribute to the standardization process, not your status as some kind of an corporate entity. And then there was IP addresses. So these were internet resources. They had to have unique
globally unique numbers assigned to different users so that you could make these addresses work. And you start getting what we call now regional internet registries in the early 1990s. And they too were still transnational, unlike the IETF, which was global. The RIRs were regional, but still not based on any kind of a nation state model. And their governance was based on contract. When they finally formalized, it was based on private contracts, and they were eventually incorporated as private nonprofits. Again, not a state actor. Then you get to the domain name system, and you had the problem of the DNS root, which is what I wrote my first serious book about, or my second serious book, I should say. This was this very interesting common pool resource that was suddenly commercialized, almost unexpectedly commercialized, and people were appropriating from it, and there was some really overwhelmed computer scientist trying to coordinate this, and we were confronted with a very serious problem of where do we go with this? How do we institutionalize this authority to decide what goes into the root and what becomes a top-level domain? And there was also a BGP routing. So this is actually one of the most interesting aspects of the internet that people know very little about, and that is, how do they know how to get from me and my computer to your computer? There is no global central authority that says, here's how it's going to do. There's no Ma Bell of the internet that absolutely controls internet routing. It's a very decentralized and distributed process. Of course, the standard that governs it is unified and singular, coming from the IETF. But the process of routing is really a form of networked governance in the very literal sense.
And there will be a quiz at the end, right? With all these acronyms.
I'm defying his instructions to spell out all acronyms. You know what I'm talking about. So these governance institutions literally formed outside of the national legal and regulatory regimes. They were transnational. They were rooted in private actors. Now, it's common to characterize this as the multi-stakeholder model, but I'll ask you to forget about that rhetoric. I could tell you a story about where that rhetoric came from and why it was adopted, but I don't have time for that. The key feature is not the presence of multiple stakeholders. I mean, come on, there's multiple stakeholders in governmental processes. There's public hearings, there's voters, and so on. What's unique about these institutions is the supremacy of the non-state actor. It's the way the problem of global governance was solved by transcending national governance mechanisms through transnational communities of non-state actors. Now, all of these areas are areas of internet governance where compatibility and connectivity are the prime directive. And that means there's a Nash equilibrium on cooperation. Like driving on the right side of the street, you either do that or you have seriously bad consequences, right? More difficult areas of internet governance soon arose, which do not so easily equilibrate. These are the areas where articulation with territorial states has become unavoidable. So here I'm talking about content regulation, cybercrime, where you have issues of putting people in jail, or at least catching them and prosecuting them, privacy and data protection, cybersecurity, and particularly with this latter part, the cybersecurity, it's no longer just about the security of the internet user, unfortunately. The security of internet resources, it has intersected with national security and with the military power of the states. So these areas in which the state is reinvoked, which cannot be easily equilibrating on a coordinated global mechanism or institutional mechanism, has created what I call the pressures to alignment. By alignment, I mean the attempt to fit internet governance into the boundaries, back into the territories of the nation state. Let me just briefly describe, I could go on about this for hours, the things that are happening with respect to alignment. Probably you're most familiar with the whole idea of bordering content, of introducing filters and censorship and blocking at the national level, which is typically enforced through some kind of control over the telecommunications infrastructure. And the Great Firewall of China being one of the key examples of that, although I would remind you that a lot of the censorship in China, in fact, most of the censorship is internal rather than external. We sort of elevate our importance in China when we put so much emphasis on the Great Firewall, but it's certainly, there's a lot going on internally as well. Another key element of alignment is what's come to be known as data localization. And this is the practice of limiting storage, movement, or processing of data to specific geographies. And it's all about jurisdiction, really. So Vietnam's Ministry of Public Security has just passed cybersecurity legislation that requires all foreign online service providers to store the data of Vietnamese citizens exclusively in local data centers. The Brazilian Central Bank has proposed some cybersecurity regulations that prohibit financial institutions from using foreign data processing and cloud computing services. Belgium, Denmark, Germany, the UK, and Finland are some of the European countries that require companies to store commercial data locally. In Sweden, companies are required to store information locally to share it with authorities, and that's because the authorities have interpreted a legal requirement to provide immediate access as meaning physical access to servers. So obviously then the data has to be stored locally. Russia has just passed a data localization law. China's national security and cybersecurity laws limit operation of critical internet infrastructure to mainland China, and they impose local data storage requirements on operators and broad restrictions on outgoing data as well. In addition, we have a growing tendency to look at the equipment supply chain with suspicion and talk about national origin. So you may be familiar with the attack on Huawei, a Chinese telecommunications equipment manufacturer in the United States. Essentially, the intelligence community decided that they didn't like the idea that people were buying Chinese infrastructure, and they started saying, this is suspicious, this is dangerous, and they succeeded in driving Huawei completely out of the US market, if not the entire North American market. You've probably heard about Kaspersky, which is an internet security firm headquartered in Russia. You used to be able to see them on stores. They sold antivirus software. They're still actually somewhat boldly advertising in the United States their services, but they have been targeted by the US government, and there's actually a specific provision in the defense budget that prohibits US government agencies from using Kaspersky software, and there's been some pressure on stores like Best Buy not to carry it. But then maybe the NSA's suspicions about this stem from their own behavior, because among the Snowden revelations, we discovered that there was a program in which the NSA would intercept US equipment that was going to foreign countries, install implants in it that would allow them to monitor the networks that they were sent to and not be detected. And so this, of course, was something that heightened the suspicions. In general, the Snowden revelations were a big boost to the whole idea of alignment, or what some people call technological sovereignty. Now, these concerns about cybersecurity are now restricting the flow of investment, the flow of capital. So we have the Committee on Foreign Investment in the US, And the powers of that have just been expanded by new legislation, which has already been used somewhat inexplicably to block an acquisition of Qualcomm by a Singaporean firm. Didn't know Singapore was a military threat to the United States, but you never know. Of course, the Chinese have always restricted U.S. investment or any kind of foreign investment getting a majority ownership share of any kind of an information infrastructure. And finally, we have growing jurisdictional competition over privacy and data protection laws. The GDPR is in some ways a good thing because it leveraged the size of the European market to globalize privacy protection. But the problem is, what if the US responds with legislation of its own, which is incompatible with the GDPR, and then we get into a jurisdictional war? And the current head of the NTIA has essentially threatened to do just that. So we have a battle between the global access of the internet and state alignment. And that is the main problem in internet governance right now. Almost everything that's going on can be traced back to that in one way or another. And as I've written in my latest book, this conflict is all about sovereignty, the tensions between sovereignty and cyberspace. So let's talk about the theory of sovereignty. The principle of state sovereignty is one of the most important concepts underpinning the world's governance institutions. The theory dates back to Baudin in the 16th century. The practice is more recent. Yet one will search the canons of institutionalist literature for any mention of or discussion of sovereignty. You can look at Ostrom, you can look at North, Knight, Bates. They don't mention much less extended discuss the idea or the theory of sovereignty. There's some attention paid to the state, to the theory of the state, its origins and its functions. But sovereignty, the institution that regulates the relations among states, is pretty much absent from the discussion. Now, talking about the theory of the state, I don't think anybody did it any better than Weber and his statement that the state is a monopoly on the legitimate use of force. If we look at how sovereignty relates to that, sovereignty sort of bounds that legitimate use of force to a specific territory in order to mitigate uncontrolled uses of violence in the international sphere. As an institution, it's intended to limit and contain the anarchy that exists among states and to regulate the effects of these monopolies on violence by confining them to a designated territory and establishing a reciprocal set of relationships among sovereign units. So the idea is, okay, we've got these monopolies on violence, they're kind of dangerous, let's tell them where they have this monopoly and where they don't, and hopefully that will somehow promote world peace. So if Leviathan solves the problem of anarchy domestically, sovereignty is supposed to do the same internationally. It basically assumes that each functioning government is legitimate in its own territory and then applies these reciprocal rules of non-intervention and voluntary interaction to each sovereign unit. Now, the theory was in the 16th century, the Peace of Westphalia, which incorrectly is ascribed the beginnings of sovereignty. It was 350 years ago, but my contention is that you don't really get anything approaching a Westphalian system until the end of World War II, the end of the big European colonial empires and national liberation movements and all of that. But even so, the impact of sovereignty on the international system is limited. Anarchy among states is still a reality. A careful study of the forms and practices of sovereignty led political scientist Stephen Krasner to conclude that it is best understood as, quote, organized hypocrisy. By that, he meant a space somewhere between anarchy and institutionalization, where rulers adhere to the norms and practices of sovereignty when it offers them resources and support, and they deviate from it when violating these norms provides them with tangible benefits. So there is a growing trend to think that to deal with the problems of internet governance, we need to turn towards sovereignty. This push comes from thinkers at the intellectual level and from the practical policymaker level and from the rational pursuit of their self-interest by states. So I want to explain why sovereignty in cyberspace is not a good idea and why we don't want to go that path. I'm not going to say it's impossible. I am going to say that in order to achieve it, we would have to sacrifice so much of what the internet offers in value that it would not be worth the trade-off. So let's begin my case by making the point that obviously there are domains where sovereignty is recognized to not belong. And the most clearly recognized are the high seas and outer space. The high seas has long been recognized as not subject to sovereign claims. The US government itself has long been a vigorous advocate for freedom of navigation and has resisted what it views as excessive claims by other states of jurisdiction over international passages or ocean space. So somewhere in there, there's an understanding of the reasons why you might want freedom of navigation or a non-sovereign space. Same is true of outer space. The treaty passed in 1967 banned participants from putting nuclear weapons in space. And in Article 2 stated that outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, is not subject to national appropriation by claim of sovereignty, use, occupation, or any other means. So there are these exceptions or exemptions, if you will, from sovereignty that already exist. Now, the other point I'll make are two other points, actually three other points about why we don't want to apply sovereignty or why it doesn't work. Number one, let's recognize the internet protocols as a public good. They are open source, they are non-proprietary, anyone can implement them, and there is an unlimited number of networks that can be assigned unique network numbers in the internet protocols. I say unlimited, well, okay, there's a technical standard that says there are now about 3 billion or 3.7 billion possible network numbers that could be assigned in the internet. And this was completely unique. In the old days, the government would decide how many networks are going to be. There's going to be 5, there's going to license 6 or 10 or maybe 1 or 2. The internet was just like, you want to be a network? Okay, here's an autonomous system number. You're a network. Run the internet protocols and you're a network. So you have this sort of open invitation to be a network with the internet protocols. Now, once you have this, these internet protocols, and this is the hardest part of the argument, create a virtual space that is non-territorial. It's a network of networks. The word "the internet" is actually kind of a misnomer because it's just a protocol for sharing data among independently managed networks. So its boundaries are autonomous systems, not geographic territories. And an autonomous system is not a physical layer phenomenon. It's instantiated at layers 3 and 4 as software. Now, of course, physical facilities are necessary to run the software and transmit and store the information. But as soon as the internet protocols are running on those physical facilities are part of a non-territorial virtual space through which people can interact really without regard to geography. Now, of course, it's also true that we can now detect where you are geographically when you're running these protocols, but that's an application that we are overlaying on this space. It's not necessarily part of the space. So generally, the security problem in cyberspace is not territorial or national. It embraces the entire virtual arena. Data packets can contain threats, regardless of where they come from, whether they're inside or outside a country's borders. Packets that come from inside the borders can be generated by agents outside the borders if they're able to control domestic computers. There's remote control going on there. Threats, intrusions, malware can and do come from anywhere in the world. And that's what makes a cybersecurity problem so interesting, right? It's the AS boundary and the security of information assets, not jurisdictional boundaries, that matter. Autonomous systems can avail themselves of firewalls, routing policies, intrusion detection, and authentication to protect themselves. But these defensive technologies are most effectively deployed at the AS level, not at the country level. So it's best to look at the internet as not a collection of national networks, but as a collection of autonomous systems that are woven together by these protocols at the software layer. One more argument about sovereignty in cyberspace. It just struck me the other day, the theory of the state says, it's a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. So does this make sense in cyberspace? Does anyone have a monopoly on the legitimate use of cyber force? It seems like nobody does. Once you're dealing with global connectivity and instantaneous and invisible action across national boundaries, there's actually no relevant distinction between state actors and non-state actors anymore. Neither one has a monopoly, neither one has legitimacy outside of its own territory. So if a cyber attacker and all of her victims happen to be in the territory of a single state, then sure, normal rule of law applies. The aggressor can be identified, arrested, prosecuted. But with transnational actors, and most of the cybersecurity problems we're dealing with are of that type, it's difficult to maintain any distinction between a state actor and a non-state actor. There are attackers and the defenders, adversaries and victims, and that's pretty much it. So let's assume for a moment that some unknown entity of some unknown type could achieve a monopoly on the use of cyber force that was perceived as widely legitimate. How could such a thing be contained in a geographical location? How in a globally compatible cyberspace? I don't think it could be. It would have to be a global monopoly, and that would mean a global sovereign, or it would mean our whole notion of territorial sovereignty would pretty much go out the window. Interested to see how the international lawyers react to this argument.
With a lot of land.
So if we consider the internet to be a global commons, now I'm going to tell you the normal arguments that I hear against this idea. The first is, well, aren't states asserting their control? Aren't they asserting their sovereignty? Aren't they going to create it? And the answer is yes and no. States are indeed asserting their power, but states cannot assert sovereignty over or in cyberspace. They can only regulate the way people or things subject to their authority access global cyberspace. And that's an important distinction. It may sound like a weaselly distinction, but it's actually very similar to the situation with ocean governance. It's like, if you're in the territorial waters, we can shoot at you or blow you up or prevent you from entering. We can do all kinds of things. So there's more sovereignty there in the territorial waters than there are out in the rest of the high seas. There's really no national cyberspace over which they're exercising supreme authority. Rather, there's a shared global cyberspace, and they leverage their sovereignty over actors and devices under their authority to restrict connections to certain sites or applications. But this happens in a very imperfect and limited way because they are not in control of who joins the internet outside of their territory. So all kinds of things are happening out there that they have to constantly be monitoring and responding to if they really want to maintain some kind of control over their so-called national cyberspace. The other argument I hear is that, well, the internet is not a commons. Come on, you're paying, what's your least favorite ISP here? Comcast? You're paying them $100 a month to get broadband internet. That's an exclusive service. Where's the commons here? You're paying Google with your data when you access them. You have to log in. There's no commons. And of course, you know, OSTROM was very aware of the fact that not every commons is an open access commons. But the real nub of the argument here is that the internet's architecture combines commons with private property, and that's what's made it so successful. So the internet protocols are based on these open, non-proprietary standards and open source software. So the protocols are non-rival in use, and no user can exclude anybody else from implementing them. Most of the facilities and services are interconnected through these protocols are, of course, not a commons. The devices, the autonomous systems, the applications and services are all pretty much private goods. And we get the best of both worlds. We have a commons connecting us together, bringing us together, and we have private goods in which people can market their wares. And isn't that the case with all kinds of markets? We have the village square, which is a commons, and the people set up their little kiosks and sell things, right? So market and commons always go together. So it's okay to say that cyberspace is a global commons and the internet services and facilities are not most of the time. It's not contradictory in the least. You know, space satellites are physical objects owned by a specific company or country, and the services they provide can be exclusive private goods, but outer space is a commons. And the ships are physical objects owned by a particular company or country. They're under sovereign jurisdiction, but the sea is a commons. There's no incompatibility here. And I think one of the reasons the US was toying with the idea of calling the internet a global commons around the time of like 2007 to 2010. And then people started making this argument that the internet is not a commons, and they pulled back from that. So I think it was based on a kind of a conceptual mistake. All right, so now the most difficult question is, what difference does it make? This is, I don't know if you know Catherine Lotrianti, this is the argument that we had. It's like, what happens if we abandon notions of sovereignty? Does anything good happen? Does anything at all happen? And of course, the pragmatic answer to that is, of course, nothing automatically happens. It's not like the world, you know, the clouds part and with the hymns, you hear the music and angels descend from heaven and the internet is all right again. What I think you get are three possible benefits. Number one is reduced conflict. Number one, you're shifting the criterion for decision making. And number three, you're shifting the decision makers. So in terms of reduced conflict, I think we can all understand how undesirable it would be if the US or any other country asserted sovereignty over outer space or the seas, or if they decided that certain big parts of the ocean were under their sovereignty. Those positions could only be maintained via constant military conflict. And indeed, we've seen some dangerous noises coming from first the Bush and now the Trump administration about outer space, which could be leading us in that direction. So rather than searching for justification of their actions through assertions of their absolute authority over distinct pieces of the world or the world itself, a commons approach requires states to recognize their coexistence in cyberspace, not only with other states, but more importantly, with business and civil society. Secondly, it shifts the criteria for decision-making. So a global commons concept elevates the value of connectivity and compatibility relative to other goals. It says, you know, that's just as important, if not more important, than certain notions of national security and cybersecurity conceived as a national good. It articulates the global internet using public's interest in an interconnected and open space, which is kind of an ideal that is getting lost in all the kerfuffle about regulation and control of cyberspace. It affirms the importance of freedom of action and permissionless innovation, all of which fosters economic and technological development, in my opinion. And then again, it realigns who we think of as the key decision makers. If we're talking sovereignty, then states are elevated to the supreme position. The non-sovereign approach does not privilege states over private actors. Both are equal status inhabitants and creators of the space. When generally applicable cyberspace governance is needed, it must arise through multi-stakeholder cooperation at the global or transnational level. Such an approach strengthens the hand of civil society and private sector actors. At the same time, it does not really interfere with purely domestic regulatory efforts of states. So even if a commons model does not automatically eliminate the political incentives of states to engage in alignment, it helps to contain it and limit its scope. It deprives it of ideological comfort, if you will. It makes it clear that states cannot and should not have the kind of authority over cyberspace that some of them are seeking. So there's a problem here, a practical problem that, frankly, I haven't thought through completely. So ELINOR Ostrom emphasized the ability of communities to develop self-governing institutions that don't have to be based on the hierarchical authority of an external power like a state. As we have seen, self-governance by a transnational internet community is both possible and in some respects already exists because of these organically developed internet institutions. The problem with the self-governance approach in international affairs is that they are dealing with the organized violence of states in ways that appear to touch on their military capabilities. Most of the Ostrom literature on self-governance has assumed that the cooperation and self-governance takes place within a context of civil order. And that kind of assumes an authority with a monopoly on the legitimate use of force somewhere in the background. So whatever governance regime we settle upon in cyberspace must take state power and the realities of military conflict among states into account. But does this mean that we are doomed to revert to the territorially fragmented governance of a sovereignty-based model? I think not. I think we can find ways to reconcile the two, what I call the problem of articulation, where we delegate some things that are global outside of the territorial states and work them through, but it's not going to be easy. How do we keep state control bounded by territory while at the same time freeing the producers and users of cyberspace to govern themselves? How do we maintain interterritorial peace among states while civil society and business take the lead in cyberspace? Can we use the territorial civil order established by states as a foundation for transnational civil governance of cyberspace? In effect, I'm asking, can we demilitarize and denationalize cyberspace? I'll leave you with that question. Thank you very much.
This is brilliant. Plenty of food for thought, I think it's fair to say. We only have about 10 or so minutes, but we can start the discussion now. They continue it upstairs. Does anybody have a question to start us off? Diane. Now, I'll move over here. Yeah.
About this idea that there might end up being two internets, one controlled by the one controlled by US and the West.
Why only two? I think it would, if you're going to go that route, yeah. So you do have some kind of polarization around the issue of sovereignty. So Russia and China are the leading powers who are actively promoting the idea of the sovereignty in cyberspace. And the US, unfortunately, I think is kind of inconsistent and muted in its approach now because they're not clear about what they're going for anymore. Which, yes, indeed, America first, and you know, the whole anti-globalization initiative. So the first thing is that the threat is not so much a well, I guess you could say that there's a threat of a digital Cold War evolving in which these two sides. But if you compare that to the real Cold War, when we were, you know, shooting and killing each other in third world countries over the same conflict, I think this is a much more manageable problem. And as I wrote in my book about will the internet fragment, the key thing is that at layer 3, the world is completely unified, right? We are all running internet protocol. The Chinese are running internet protocol. The Russians are running it. If you're talking about 2 different internets, you're talking about a new technical standard. And the network externalities and network effects of creating an incompatibility are so hugely, overwhelmingly powerful that even China and even Russia are not going to stop running internet protocol. So they're going to run it, and they're going to just try to control their national access as much as possible. And I think, at least I hope, that if we, demilitarize and denationalize cyberspace as much as possible, that eventually these countries will gradually open up more to the internet. I knew you wouldn't buy that, but
Yeah, hopefully. So I don't forget who was next. I think Frederica, and then we'll go from there. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. My question, I guess, has to do with the distinction between ontology and function about the internet. And from an ontological perspective, I can follow your argument that the internet is a super stable sort of tool. But in fact, though, when you think about function, like there are elements of the internet that become more powerful in the United States. Thinking about the Russian hacking, so I wonder if sort of there's a way of flipping the argument on its head and reflecting on the degree to which the internet is actually putting pressure on the data definition of the state, where state power is just simply no longer territorially based.
no, that's a good, that's not at all inconsistent with what I'm saying, because when the states use the internet and leverage it for their own political or military ends, they are completely non-territorial. I mean, look at the map of Snowden's, he laid out a map of all of the listening posts and plants that we had in different countries. It was totally global. And you can do the same thing with certain forms of Chinese implants and so on. And when the Russians start using social media in other countries to try to influence public opinion, obviously there are precedents for that. We had Radio Free Europe, and they had Russia Today before they were doing that. But you really have globalized it quite a bit. And that's one thing I don't like actually about the US reaction to the Russian penetration of social media, is that now we are, again, trying to nationalize the social media and saying, okay, we're going to apply restrictions based on what country you're from. Okay, it's all right to try to identify artificial bots and so on and make that transparent, but the idea that disinformation, that Russian disinformation is worse than, let's say, Trump's disinformation. What logic is there behind that? So if you're gonna regulate disinformation, what does the foreign source of it have to do with anything? So, Mr. Liu, I got to see you over there. What do you?
Very interesting is that recently, SpaceX sent a number of satellites and provided Wi-Fi signal globally.
Mm-hmm.
I think this will fundamentally change the internet sovereignty in the future few years, because recently there is some Chinese scholars and warning to the government, to the Chinese government, say that information censorship will be eventually not physically possible because of the satellites Wi-Fi. So, do you think this will change?
Yeah, well, as optimistic as I am, I think I would not say that the censorship is going to be physically impossible. It will just become more costly. So they will have to do more and more to regulate access to these space-based items. They'll have to control the import of equipment that provides access to that. Maybe they'll just have spies running around that grab people that are using these things and arrest them. I mean, again, they can do it, but as the costs rise, it becomes more and more difficult. And again, that's what I mean about cyberspace. You can assert national control over objects and people under your authority, but because there's all kinds of things going out in global cyberspace that you can't control, there's always this problem of new technologies or new access mechanisms or new applications that that undermine your control.
I think we have time for a few more. Yes.
I'm thinking of the like other kinds of sovereignty other than that. And it seems like then it gets really complicated because it seems like there are many instances in which you have nations or even states taking actions that actually protect some open elements of the internet and or protect like denizens of the internet from the actions of these massive platforms. So I think about like our rights as individuals and as users of these platforms, it opens up other questions that I'm not sure internet governance as it's currently formulated, multi-stakeholder wise, it really sets us up to answer. Like the European GDPR is regulation that's establishing, I think, pretty basic fundamental rights for humans, and it's only come out of this international body. Likewise, like California just defended net neutrality in the face of, I think, abdication of the FCC's responsibility. You have other instances like where India strikes out against internet.org, which was a for the internet itself from Facebook. So I guess I wonder, is the model of multi-stakeholder governance that emerged in the late 80s and 90s, is that actually serving us in the face of these massive global platforms?
Yeah, I think that if you look at, I mean, I would quibble with your big examples are the GDPR, India and internet.org, and net neutrality legislation at the state level. So I think that the problem with net neutrality legislation at the state level is this problem of jurisdictional fragmentation. You know, you get different rules for different parts of the internet, and that's going to be a problem. Now, I don't disagree that states, in their capacity as territorial authorities, can in fact protect human rights in certain ways. So, yeah, if somebody's DDoSing you and stopping you from speaking, or if a big platform is stealing your data and leaking it in ways that are harmful, there's nothing inherently wrong with making him liable and regulating him to do that. What you don't want, however, is number one, forms of regulation that are extremely restrictive to speech and innovation, technical innovation, which inevitably seems to happen with so many of these state initiatives, that they're more about the politicians making political capital from attacking the big corporation than they are about actually protecting rights. So the attack on Section 230, I don't know how familiar you are with what's going on in that. You know, the platforms are a convenient scapegoat for problems that they have simply made visible, right? GDPR is actually kind of a good case because it globalized privacy protection. If it had just been Germany or France saying, here's a whole bunch of new restrictive privacy regulations that they only apply here in our territory, but they, because again of the leverage that they had over the market size, basically most of the world had to conform to that or is conforming to it in a process. So we're getting what we needed, which was global governance of privacy and data protection. And I think the privacy movement, the civil society actors had as much to do with that as the states. Because I can't go into the details here, but we've been struggling with various forms of data protection in the ICANN context, and I know where all of the stakeholders stand in that regard. And you literally have governments within GAC who are opposing forms of data protection because of their law enforcement interests, as opposed and the data protection interests within these governments were subordinated to the law enforcement interests. So you don't really know where the states are going to come down all the time, and you have to be realistic about the sort of the public choice elements of that. That was a long-winded answer.
I appreciate you planting the flag. the commons answer, because usually in this space, if you guys are familiar, it's a pseudo commons. It's an imperfect commons, right? I was just picking up off your last point though. Secretary of State Clinton talks about cyberspace as a global networked commons, but also one where certain internet freedoms, kind of building off of FDR's 4 freedoms, we think should be sacrosanct. And I'm wondering, how you see kind of internet freedom, a notion mapping on to kind of multi-stakeholder internet governance, and what the legs, for that idea is now at a time when we seem to be kind of disengaging from a lot of internet governance fora.
Well, it's very unfortunate. The whole idea of internet freedom has come under attack recently by people as intelligent as Jack Goldsmith, right? There's something by Karen Kornbluh. This came out from the Council on Foreign Relations, and they're basically saying, all this libertarian, non-regulatory stuff is just passé, and we really need to be more aggressive. And again, I think that's the U.S. version of alignment. We're trying to assert American leadership, they call it. That was one of the ambiguities and problems with Hillary's Internet Freedom Initiative. That was perceived as an attack on the sovereignty of other nations. And the State Department was a bit selective in who they funded, so that if you were like investigating Iran or some other American ally or American enemy, you got lots of money. And if you were just more generally devoted and you were investigating it in the U.S. or problems of freedom of speech in other parts of the world that weren't part of the sort of the geopolitical alignment of the U.S., you didn't get any money. So that kind of tainted the idea of internet freedom in ways and nationalized it in ways that were not productive. Got a lot of questions. I'm happy to stay here beyond 6 if you can.
One last one, then we can continue the discussion afterward. You've had your hand up for a while. Would you like to? Yeah, sure. Yeah.
So I love the idea, the comparison you made, the analogy you're making to the ocean and space as global resources that ought to be managed as commons, and that society has decided collectively to manage as a commons. There are things that are resources to manage as commons because of all the benefits from doing so. But what's interesting, and so maybe, and I kind of agree with you, that thinking of the internet that way or cyberspace that way makes a whole lot of sense for a variety of reasons. But when you think about it, right, the ocean and space are managed as governed as a commons, managed as a commons because of a consensus agreement reached by sovereigns. And so I'm wondering if the path that you're imagining involves may even be contingent upon a similar consensus agreement among sovereigns to not assert their sovereignty and recognize it. And if that's the case, do you think that's just next to impossible to imagine happening? In which case, how do you imagine the world you want to exist, I want to exist?
There's peace pacts for cyberspace. And even that encroachment is happening in the oceans.
Yes. As it is.
You're across these domains. So.
Yeah.
Would you care to respond to that?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I think the difference with the internet, maybe the seas was like this also. Essentially, there was, it was occupied by private actors first, and it was developed by private actors under the nose of the governments before they knew what was happening. And then it became a global medium before they knew how to control it. So we're in the reaction phase now, and they're beginning to understand how to control it. But I think we need the equivalent of cyber maritime powers, which is who fought for the freedom of the seas. It was, the Dutch and then the British and so on. And the US was upholding that because they were a maritime power and they needed and wanted and understood the benefits of an open commons in this resource space. So I think if the US exerted that leadership, again, hopefully not nationalizing the concept in the way that Hillary Clinton did, but and we got some allies. I don't think that it's necessary for states to support the concept for cyberspace to actually be a global commons, but I certainly think it would help. the encroachment process and the militarization process, especially the militarization process, if states would just say, yeah. And the space, you know, is an example of the kind of political constellation that had to happen. So we had, you know, a very easy coordination problem, right? The US and the Soviet Union were basically the two powers with nuclear weapons. The US was paranoid about a sneaky nuclear attack, and the Russians knew that we had superiority. So it was kind of a relatively easy compromise for them both to say, yeah, space is like open to all, and we can all fly over and watch each other, and we can exploit it commercially. Cyberspace right now is a lot more complicated. I totally agree. But if we don't plant the flag, as he said, and raise and wave the flag, then we're never going to get there for sure. So
Claim this land for cyberspace. A round of applause for.